Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for joining us for this evening's live Q&A for the IFC Film Dating and New York. Before we jump in, just to let you know, you will have the opportunity to submit questions. So if you have any audience questions throughout the evening, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box at the bottom. And it is my great pleasure to introduce writer and director Jonah Feingold and actress Francesca Reale.
Is this when the camera comes on?
This is when the camera comes on. This is when the magic happens. Well, Jonah, I wanted to dive straight in by talking a little bit about the overarching way in which you wanted to tell this story, because it has a lot of very classical elements, particularly looking at 90s rom-coms, but really looking at a lot of different time periods where you've pulled in different stylistic and narrative elements to the film. But also I know for you that part of the genesis of telling this story was wanting to have something that really tapped into the modern idea of dating. And we see that through a lot of the use of social media as a form of communication, what the specifics are of being posted on someone's Instagram story versus the grid. And so in terms of pulling together all of these different time periods of this genre, how did you really figure out the way that you wanted to pull it together into such a cohesive genre of its own for modern times?
Great question. We had a setting on iMovie that just said export files, effects, make it modern but old school. And no, I think the rules we set for ourselves was that we wanted to make a rom-com that felt timeless, a movie that had sort of, from a production standpoint, spherical lens, sort of a nice mist to it with the Promise filter, all sort of static shots, performances that felt inherently nostalgic. Shout out to Francesca for nailing that. And also taking the classic standpoint. I mean, we went for classic, modern, old school MGM vibe, and then we said let's inject modern text messaging to that. So let's have a text message sequence, but under a jazz score. Let's have an Instagram grid, but the camera moves around that moment in just the way that the dolly would. And you don't ever really see text messages come up next to a character, because to me that's going the modern approach first. And I think it was a combination of all those things, plus just having a very sort of nostalgic aesthetic quality, a very soft looking film that makes it feel like it's something from a long time ago, minus the fact that, yeah, we have an Instagram grid debate about what it means to go on the grid versus the story. So I think by doing all those, just stirring up that pot, we got that aesthetic.
And I love that you were bringing up the idea of how the performances even go into that nostalgic element as well, and really cross over into the modern and the classic as well. And so Francesca, wanted to talk to you a little bit about that and how Jonah really conveyed a lot of those details and what the most useful pieces of information were that he gave to you in order to figure out your character development and how your performance was going to fit into that structurally within the film.
Well, Jonah was incredibly collaborative, and also apologies for my raspy voice. A lot of talking this week. But Jonah was incredibly collaborative. I mean, when I initially signed on to the movie, we had like a huge call where I had like my thoughts on like the version of the script that I was reading and what I thought of Wendy, and he gave me his version of what he wanted her to look like, and I gave him my version. And we kind of settled on this like really nice blend of like Sally from When Harry Met Sally and like Elaine from Seinfeld. And then when I even got to New York, we kind of like went through the script line by line, and it was a really wonderful collaborative process, which is why I think she came out so beautifully in the film.
Yeah. And I love the way that both performance wise and from your directing standpoint for both of you, that you've worked with the dialogue, and there's that really intimate pacing to the way that, you, Francesca, and Jabuki particularly have conversations with each other. And it really expresses the intimacy and the connection between these characters in the way that they talk with each other, and they're almost overlapping a little bit. And so for the two of you, was interested in the development of that particular style of approach, and then how you all worked within the scenes to make that look, that really come across and feel that way in every moment.
Wasn't that the big note, Jonah? It was like,
Yeah.
great, but like, let's just do it one more time and faster.
Yeah, I was ready for you to say that. The note was always like, perfect, that was amazing, we're done, except we're going to do it once more, but just like kill the dead space and faster.
Kill the dead space and faster. Yes,
Yeah.
kill the dead space and faster. And then Jabuki and I were literally in his Girl Friday at a certain point, just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. 1920s newsroom.
Yeah. It's about killing the dead space on set. I mean, I used to be obsessed with watching like B-roll footage. I'm still obsessed with this. You watch B-roll footage of like big, like a Wes Anderson movie, like, you know, Grand Budapest. And it's like, how do those big films, what does the raw footage, the dailies look like? And I feel like in those kind of movies, which I loved, they were like, they say the words and then there's no pauses in between each line. It's kind of like a long sentence. And I think that was, by the way, that helped. And their chemistry, they were so, you know, Francesca and Jabuki got so good at it that it ultimately, the note didn't need to be, actually was eventually, by the end of it, was like, slow down here. This is like an emotional scene. It's like the big kiss. So yeah, I think it's just a wonderful collaboration.
Like when you definitely knocked me over during our kiss, we were just going so fast that it like, I just went tumbling down.
Well, you were bringing up the chemistry, and Francesca and Jabuki actually didn't have an opportunity to have a chemistry test, which for a rom-com, you know, is something that is often very helpful in terms of just figuring out if that dynamic is going to work. And so for you, Jonah, I wanted to ask about the way in which you said that you went online and you kind of took some of their clips from their work and pulled it aside each other to just see how that dynamic worked with them as performers. And then for you, Francesca, how the fact that the first scene that you shot was one where you didn't know each other as well yet, and how that actually really helped the two of you to actually develop that very natural build of chemistry throughout the film.
Yeah, well, starting off, this might be news to you. When we were like going the early phases of, which is great. This is live here on, you know, on the Zoom. I used my iPhone. I like just recorded scenes, and I was with my production team, and we were all just figuring out, honestly, it started off from a standpoint of lighting. How are we going to are both these characters going to have the same lighting setup, backlight, front light, all that? And then I was like, this is a good time for me to find out, even though everyone's been cast, probably a good find to see if they are going to have chemistry. And so we took some of those scenes and I added some music, and it was just sort of intercut. And I was like, oh yeah, this is totally going to work. And obviously, you know, when you study rom-coms, you hear so many situations of chem tests and chemistry that works great and chemistry that doesn't work great. So you're nervous going into it. But I was like, we got so lucky that Francesca and Jabuki are like, you know, they had this perfect energy together, and it worked out.
Yeah, I mean, Jabuki and I have actually talked about this, I feel like, quite a bit in these little interviews, but we're not sure if it was like an accident on production or if they intentionally did it this way, but it was randomly, like, we noticed that when we're first meeting, when we first started shooting, we're like doing all the really like kind of intense, like they're not in a good place scenes, you know, like they're talking about like, what are we, or they're like having their fight, or they're kind of doing that whole like, why are you being weird thing. And so we were doing all that as we were first meeting, which it's really easy to kind of create an awkward, kind of uncomfortable situation when you don't really know the person already, because it's already like awkward and uncomfortable. So it was just like, honestly, beautiful planning that was either totally on purpose or completely by accident. But, you know, we got to do those really like intense scenes when we weren't super familiar with one another. And then later we did all like the really like, they're good, they're thriving, they're on their first date, everything's romantic, everything's like very compatible. The chemistry is wild as we actually got to like be friends. So it was kind of like very serendipitous. I don't know. It just like worked out that way. And that, I think, was one of the best ways, given that we didn't have a chem test together.
So Jonah, was it something that was intentional, or was it just a lot of that scheduling logistics of shooting 22 locations in 15 days?
It's a perfect combination of, it's actually both, right? It's like that beautiful thing in filmmaking where the things that are going to help, things that are going to make your movie special are also things that might get in the way of your perfect version of how to make the movie. And I think it just worked out schedule wise. And yeah, it was intentional that we wanted to toss in that ice cream scene first, certainly. But after that, I think we would have probably loved to have you go on a first date, but ultimately it was time for a breakup, and it was time for all these other things we had to do. So yeah.
Yeah, we broke up like 3 days after we actually met.
Yeah. All the more.
Francesca, I love that Jonah was bringing up the ice cream scene, because there's a lot of moments where there's really great opportunities to play to the subtext, and your characters are having conversations, but the conversation that they're actually having is completely different to the dialogue that you're delivering. And so how did that play into the way that you worked with the scripts and worked with the text in really figuring out what is the underlying dialogue and what's the conversation that we're actually having at hand, and then carrying that through to your performance with Jabuki?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to have to take a minute. That was a lot. Well, you know, the ice cream scene was actually our first day of set. literally, that was my well, I think they shot a day before, you know. Shout out to our entire production people, because they like dealt with all of our crazy schedules making this work. But that was my first day on set, was the ice cream scene. So literally the day I'm meeting Jaboukie, we're having this very passive aggressive conversation about, you know, ice cream flavors, but we're actually talking about like, what is our relationship? And was the question, how did that help me? Sorry?
Yeah, just kind of like, how did you then take a lot of the dialogue within the script and really think about for your performance the way in which you wanted to approach the subtext and the underlying conversations?
Oh, yeah. Well, that honestly was just trust in your director and trust in your co-star. You know, like it's all discussion at the end of the day. There are so few scripts I feel like you get where it really is just like, it's literally all on the page and it's all on you, and you come and you just do your thing. Like, obviously that can be the case, but in this particular situation, it was really like, you know, I think Jonah, Jaboukie, and I had a lot of like great conversations while we were all sitting getting our hair and makeup done. And Jonah would come in and we would just have a discussion about the scene. And we'd really be like, Jonah would be like, what are you thinking about it? And what do you feel about it? And here's how I see it. And it was just like, you know, I think that's what made them at the end of the day so relatable, because like the discussion we had before, it was genuinely just three people sitting around and talking about it. And then we would go just do that on set. So it was able to actually feel very human in comparison to some other things where it's like, you just do it and there's no space for change or molding. It's just like, it is what it is and you go.
Mm-hmm. And Jonah, it's not just within the characters of Wendy and Milo that you've written in that way with the dialogue. You've really made sure that every single supporting character has this fully realized sense of self and this full life on screen, you know, even down to the doorman character, which we really get all these different essences of who he is, his day-to-day, his interpersonal relationships with people around him, just from a couple of short scenes. And when you were working on the script for this, did you have a process in terms of how you would look individually at each of the characters at different stages to make sure that they were all coming across with such unique voices?
There's two reasons that happened, and one is there's like the cliche in rom-coms where like the supporting character has no arc and like they don't exist outside of the film's protagonist, and having that cliche exist in the back of our head was something that we wanted to avoid. Now, that being said, what happens when you get lucky enough to work with such amazing actors is that there's no option. They won't ever be a supporting character. Their simple presence on screen commands, you know, all the way from Kat and Brian to Arturo to Sandra James, who plays the real estate lady. And, you know, what became sort of this reverse engineering element that they don't really teach you in film school, but for all the filmmakers here, when you call an agent or you call a manager or a casting director and you're trying to cast someone to be in your movie for a day or 5 days, part of the conversation is, well, why is this worth it to my client? And when we were going through that process, casting Alex Moffat or Arturo for 6 hours, 5 hours less, you know, I wanted to make sure their time they weren't gonna get cut from the film and that their time was worth it. And so you look at the script and you say, how do I make this imperative? And how do I make this moment something that they can just shine? The whole mission objective for this movie was give actors and people who are talented the space to just fucking fly. And that's what we were able to do. That's why a lot of, I think, the takeaways are like, this cast is amazing. And that's because everyone could just I want everyone to do what they wanted to do within the context of the story. But Arturo coming in and giving us his time during Lady and the Tramp, you know, I think he just wrapped that Disney movie, and being able to say this is a big character. You're this sort of guy that, you know, Wendy used to go out with, and people need to feel that. And obviously they did great work with that scene. Spoiler alert, Francesca plays a couple roles there, but yeah, so that's how with the sort of smaller roles.
Yeah, you mentioned the phrase reverse engineering there, and there's so many different spaces and ways in which you've kind of taken reverse engineering of the genre within this film. And in particular, you've given us this setup of the friends with benefits idea, but it's really benefits that come first and then a friendship that develops from it. So it's watching this from the opposite perspective, and that really gives a lot of opportunity to play around with the idea and the expectations, and at the same time you still call out what those expectations of the genre are within the dialogue of the film as well. And so how did you want to specifically reverse engineer the expectations of what the film was going to be from that initial setup by flipping it and reversing it in that way?
A lot of that credit goes to Francesca and to Jaboukie, who first conversation we had, Fran, I think, right, was how are we going to make Wendy this new character that's the like our friends, like people that we know, and what their dating life is going through.
Yeah, I remember coming in like a pretty like hot tyrant with Jonah. He was so he was such a champ. I was like, I'm not making this female character villainized for having feelings for this. And I was fully expecting like pushback. And he was like, nope, I'm on the same page. Like, that sounds great. Let's talk it out. Let's work through it. Let's go through the script. And I was like really ready to have this like tense conversation where I was like, you know, there's like a scene in Parks and Rec, which has nothing to do with this movie, obviously, but she like has prepared argument before she goes in and she actually doesn't end up needing it. That was literally the situation where I had like prepared argument of like, this is what I'm going to say when he says no. I have a plan. And then he was just like, that sounds great. Yeah. Because yeah, they're always villainized in rom-coms. Women are so often villainized, and for being straightforward or having a clear idea of what they want and need at that period of their life. And there's so often women in like their late teens and early 20s where if it was a guy, they'd be like, well, it's just a guy in his 20s. But because it was a girl who like wants the more sexual based relationship, it's wrong, or it's negative, or it's confusing, or it's a game. And our movie, I think, is so special because she's not villainized for having that. Oddly enough, Milo sometimes actually looks, you know, interesting for not like understanding what she's saying and like getting confused and getting like, well, yeah, feelings. I have feelings now. There's that great moment, Jonah, that in the lobby with Jerry, where I'm like, well, yeah, well, we're not gonna catch feelings. And then it pans up to Jabuki and he's like, well, yeah, totally. And he's put in this position where it's super obvious, like, oh, you're getting them. Oh, you've missed the assignment, you know, like you've misunderstood the assignment completely.
Misunderstood the assignment. Yeah.
No, and I really loved the fact that it was the female character that was the one that was withholding emotions, and also that internal journey and struggle that you bring to her, where she does then start to realize that she does have these feelings, but she's not really sure how to process them or how to kind of admit it or say these things out loud. And so how did you want to carry that internal structure of where she is at all those different stages to the point where she is able to finally say it out loud?
Well, so you know what's crazy actually is like, I think, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I feel like I can, but like in the original script, like the beginning is in the beginning of the original script, she's dumped. Like you literally watch her go through this breakup scene that's really hard and really brutal. And in the edit, that isn't what happened. That it was just like reworked in editing. But so going forward and working on the script, I was going off this idea of like, this girl has just gone through such a bad breakup. So even if she's going into this relationship thinking like, oh, it's just going to be casual, it's just going to be sex, and then she starts to develop feelings, like naturally with anyone who's just left an intense relationship, they're going to have that push and pull. They're going to have that like, well, I don't know. Well, what about I don't want to do this again. Are my feelings even real? Am I just wrapped up? All that stuff. So, and it oddly worked in this edit as well, just as well as it would have worked in the original script. But it's just crazy how well that kind of that defining characteristic of her having just gone through a breakup really played into making her this like really cool character, this really cool female character in a rom-com.
Yeah. And for you, Jonah, what was the moment and the tipping point where you realized that you wanted to shift that detail? Because it is such a key detail to Francesca's point in terms of how her emotions are following that and what that dynamic is. And it's such an interesting flip to look at both the version of it that would have had that and also what it is without that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's exactly sort of as you guys were saying, like it came off in the cut that Wendy's character had a history, had some sort of, emotional, like, had a breakup of sorts, had some sort of fear of what was going to come next and not wanting to be an ex again and wanting this new part of her life. And it just came across in the performance and the undertones, and it allowed the audience to be able to do their own math in their head. And we don't need to show them the breakup, let's let them come up with their own backstory for what this character, went through. And it was pretty much a no-brainer once we took that out. And actually we recut sort of, this is the beauty of movie magic. Like literally first time feature filmmaker. So you forget how much you can really do when you have 91 minutes. Ours is 91 minutes, tried to make it 90, didn't work out. When you have 91 minutes, there's like, you cut one beat, you slow down one scene, and it has a ripple effect. So you you can do so much with your footage and your edit to make your film a better, or hopefully better. Hopefully you're not going in the wrong direction, but it was a great twist to that in my book, where we ended up using that scene for something else, which was a future relationship for Wendy's character, as opposed to a past one.
Yeah. And Jonah, I really want to talk about the use of New York in the story as well, because I think you've even joked that New York is like the third wheel to the relationship throughout. And I also think that there's such an extraordinary number of locations that you managed to film in such a short amount of time, more locations than you had shooting days. And yet every single location is so specifically thought out, so well curated in terms of the design aspects within the scene, how you're framing it, and how you really want to use each location to tell us a story. When they're in Washington Square Park, that tells a specific story. When they're kissing in front of a building and we pull back and we see all the trash. When there's, free items left on the street in New York, we all know it's the end of the month. We all know what that looks like. And so how did you, before you even went into production, start really mapping out and figuring out the way in which all these different types of locations within the city could tell such a specific story?
Growing up in New York, you walk around and you have memories associated with places in New York City. I know where I dropped my iPod video on 84th and Columbus and it cracked. And I was listening to Hey There, Delilah, because I was in love with this girl and like whatever. And like, I remember that moment so vividly. And now whenever I walk past that street, I think of that. And I think that that's what we wanted to figure out, was how do we create these memories for these locations that these characters are going to go on? From an execution standpoint, producing and production team, amazing producing team, amazing cinematographer, amazing production designer, amazing costume designer, all that, being able to do 22 locations in, 15, 16 days is a testament to your crew and how quickly they can move. And can you get in there and do it? And reverse engineering. I mean, I don't know what portion of this audience is necessarily on the indie filmmaker side, but we certainly reverse engineered what places could we get for free, what places could serve as multiple locations, so that we didn't have to necessarily change streets, but ultimately we did. And that's really how, also, like, living in New York, like, you're always scouting. It's like a saying me and my friends have, like, always be scouting, always be location scouting, have that folder on your iPhone. There's a cool shot, keep it in your notes app, and you're location scouting. And so I think that mentality also helped us find great spots. We were always just keeping an open eye.
And then going back to some of the structure of the film as well, you have this couple that start getting together and they come up with such a specific agreement of these are the really finite rules, to the point where Wendy gets it laminated for her wallet. But then obviously as time goes on, they're still sticking to the rules, but they're starting to get into this murky gray area. There's that moment where they're together in the diner and one of their rules is no PDA, and the two of you are just completely nestled into each other at that point, having a conversation, and there's a totally different type of intimacy there. And so for both of you, I was interested in how you really mapped out and felt out what those beats were and how you wanted to gradually start to break it down without ever completely pulling the rug away from the idea of what this setup is between the two of them.
Jonah, I'll let you start with that one. That definitely starts with Jonah, so I'll let him take the answer.
I will. Okay, yeah. Chronologically speaking, it does start. I think that, look, it's a movie about dating in New York, and it's PG-13, which is shocking to me. I don't know what part of our movie would make it PG-13. There might be like one fuck in the film, but like for the most part, it's a very honestly PG movie. It's a movie that is more so about the cuddling and the intimacy and the romance than it is about like the sex. And I think with these two characters, we wanted to track where they were with each other on an emotional, almost like a crush level. And I had a graph that was like, Wendy cares this much, Milo cares this much, this is where they intersect. And this was just sometimes a tool that I would use with my production design team, my costume team, to track the chronological order of this film. And sometimes it was for myself to be able to communicate with Francesca and Jabuki and say, here's what's going on here. There are very clear moments like the diner scene where we start off on that, by the way, that insert, that close-up of the hand on Jabuki's shoulder. There was one cut that wasn't in there. And then we found that in the footage and we were like, wait a second, that's a really telling moment of you just rubbing someone's shoulder, having your hand, comforted around somebody is like a super intimate, cuddly boyfriend, girlfriend thing. So we put that in, and I think it completely changes the scene. And it was a way to sort of just track what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I also think that, like, you know, and maybe this is how I felt after only watching the movie, which is interesting because I didn't feel this when we were making it, but when I watched it, I was kind of like, oh, the viewer kind of is like that 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 friend when you're in a relationship that's just like kind of always around, like the third wheel, basically. Like, I know Jonas says like New York is the third wheel, but when I was rewatching it, I was like, oh, it really does kind of feel like, that friend that's always around, that's always there. They're not going to see you having sex. They're not going to see those really intimate, like physical moments. They're going to see the random little bits where they're kind of like, and I think Brian has the line where he's like, you two are more into each other, like that's really where the film has put the audience, and that fourth wall is like, you don't need to see what they're doing. And I know there are some people that are like, oh, why isn't there sex in the movie? Why are you guys never having sex? But like, why would you need to see that to understand the development of the relationship? And why isn't it far more interesting when it's more realistic to like, if one of my friends or one of my best friends is in a relationship, I'm not going to see all the intimate stuff. I'm going to see those little moments where they're growing and becoming so close to one another. And this film puts the audience in those shoes.
I love that.
I love that too. And I hadn't thought of it that way. And you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of it's because there's so many different elements that come out in that connectivity in those scenes that we see. And wanted to actually ask you specifically about that use of body language and using that as a real dialogue to explore the intimacy between the two of them, because you have when they first kind of like feeling each other out, they're just sitting across from the table. There's no kind of like physical contact at the beginning. And then we end up at that point where they do have that intimacy when they're not even intending to. And then at the end, when they're finally letting their guards down with each other, what that looks like as well. And so how did you and Jabuki really figure out a lot of those different aspects, or was that something that just came very naturally to a lot of the scenes that you did together?
I think it just came naturally. Like I said, I mean, we had a great shooting schedule we had an indie movie shooting schedule, but we had a great like shooting schedule in the sense of like, when we were just getting to know each other, we didn't really need to be that physical with one another. So that played. And when we were doing the later shooting days, that played into this earlier version of our relationship. We were just closer. And so it just kind of fell naturally. It was kind of like, and obviously there were things where like, I'm holding Jabuki in the diner and I was like, is it okay if I put my arm here? Like there was tiny discussions, but for the most part, it was just like naturally where it fell.
Yeah. Jonah, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the music score, because I think especially for independent first features, sometimes directors can be a little hesitant to go with music composition and scores specifically, and wanted to talk about it specifically because you also had to do that fully remotely and almost set up a booth in your home where you had the movie playing and you were zooming in and having video conversations while the music was happening live and being recorded as well. And so how did that play into the way that you really figured out how you wanted music to tell such a specific story within the narrative as well?
Yeah. So straight up, the only things I would listen to for a lot of my life were film scores, John Williams, Hans Zimmer, Leonard Bernstein, all that stuff was like all I listened to. And I was like the annoying kid in film school who would put music from Jurassic Park in their shorts to the distracting extent. And I love film score. I think it's such an important part I think it's 50% of the movie. I think, look at Star Wars, Jaws, The Holiday has a wonderful score. And so I was very excited to jump into the feature world with a score. I worked with a composer on my short films, and him and I have developed like a very great shorthand. And when we approached this, I just couldn't have been more prepared, to be honest. Like, this is the one part I knew what the hell I was doing. A lot of the parts I did not know what I was doing, but the score was, I'm talking to my composer before the movie's even shot. I'm able to share with Francesca versions of Wendy's character theme over, piano and whatnot, and on set. And then we're looking at it in the dailies. And I wanted to be able to have the audience humming these character themes, and subconsciously, maybe you pick up on them, maybe you don't, but every single thing in this movie is original score. The background noises you hear in the bars and restaurants are versions of the character themes being played by a jazz band. Even down to the moment where it's the "I miss you" text and you hear the typing, we repitched the typing to be the first 8 notes of the character theme. So I just was excited to be able to make an indie rom-com that cared about the film score. And that's of course up to the audience to decide if they want to listen to it or not. But we really cared, and we were super conscious of that. Obviously a little bit bummed that I couldn't be in the studio with Grant Fonda, our composer. But hold on one second. He did.
He's gone.
He did send me this, which is our scorebook. So
amazing.
God.
You know, this is like this is just I don't know if people are ready for the interactive here, but this is you know, the opening title sequence is a song called Moonlight Serenade, which was originally written for the movie. So yeah,
like,
that's
I have to go so close to look at that. I'm like, what is it?
It's our so it's our book, but love film scores.
I also like one of the things I love in the way that you've created and told this story is the fact that, you know, even when every single time you talk about something, you're throwing out 10 different references, and you clearly have thought so much about the connectivity to the audience at every single step of the way in making this film. And I know that previously some of the jobs that you had were working in content at places like BuzzFeed and Refinery 29. And, you know, particularly with jobs in places like that, where so much is about that connection to audience and really looking at a lot of the analytics of what's working, what's landing, what are people connecting to. How did that actually feed into your work as a filmmaker for this project in really thinking about those aspects as a director as well?
It's those content places are toxic. It's like a, you know, rule number one at BuzzFeed we learned was never read the comments. And that can apply to anyone these days because we're all on the internet, you know, Instagram, whatever. I think that no matter what, I will always have the audience in mind. And when I hear the filmmakers I admire talking about their process, you know, they always say, what is audience? They're always talking about the audience first. And I think that that's such an important word as creatives, that no matter who on your crew you're talking to, your DP, your actor, your PA, the conversation should say, okay, what's audience think here? And like, that's what you got to go off of. Not if they like it or not. It's not about critics' thoughts or people's thoughts. It's about what is the audience experience going to be? Because you can't chase being liked by everybody, obviously. Which is another thing that you learn at these content places. It's like sometimes the videos that would do amazing were the videos that had nothing, no soul, no sense. You know, they were short, and then the videos that you cared about so much, no one would watch at BuzzFeed. So I think it just taught me to be less precious about certain things, and it taught me to move quickly, but to also be hyper cognizant of making things that where the audience ultimately comes first.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to jump to a couple of the audience questions that we have coming in, and there's one for you, Francesca. So what we do here, Francesca, we have a question coming in for you asking about what was the most challenging aspect of really finding your character for this film.
I think oddly the most challenging aspect of Wendy was kind of, you know, acknowledging how many similarities I have with her. I think sometimes you like look at a character and you're like, oh, I'm an actor. I'm going to be so different from the person I'm playing. Da, da, da. And you know, with her, it was weird. Like the more we started shooting, the more I was like, oh wow, we're super alike in a lot of ways. And then it became like this very weird, you know, self-reflective moment that I like called my therapist about. I was like, I think I might have like, you know, issues with like, my walls are too high. And I'm discovering it because I'm playing this character and we're doing the same thing that I would be doing. And I'm trying to rationalize it, but it's not, you know, like it became this really weird, like self-reflective thing. But that was oddly the hardest part because she actually made me like really have this like big internal look at myself, which like I couldn't say about the other roles I've played yet. So that was really cool.
Yeah. And then Jonah, this one's for you from Chloe, who's asking about what did you want the specific purpose to be in having the doorman tell Wendy that he thought Milo was seeing somebody, even if he knew it wasn't true?
People lie. People don't know the truth. You know, people in New York, when it comes to romance, it's always it's like, it's the game of telephone, you know, in this sense. Honestly, Jerry's character is sort of this scheming narrator a la Into the Woods, you know, sort of just mischievous guy who likes to stir up the pot a bit. But I think it's supposed to be a nod just more towards the fact that you always hear, oh no, they're seeing someone, they're in a relationship. Then you bump into them and they're single. You know, it's just sort of about, you can't take anything unless you just sort of hear it from the source. don't spread fake news. That's really what Jerry's character is supposed to be there for.
Don't be the doorman and lie.
Yeah.
And someone else was also asking a casting question about how did Arturo Castro and Jerry Ferrara get involved in the film with you?
Yeah, I'll give that sort of quickly. This is a testament to why you should always finish that script that you thought would never go anywhere. I wrote a script called What Are We? Jerry Ferrara's amazing wife, Brienne, read it, and she sent it to Jerry and said, you should read this script. I get a call the next day from an agent who says, Jerry Ferrara wants to meet with you. His wife read your script and he read it and he loves it. And I was like, oh my God, I love Turtle from Entourage. Are you kidding me? This is a dream come true. We meet 3 years ago at the Ace Hotel lobby. We become best friends. He's like my big bro now. It's been awesome. And then he, of course, signed on to attach and help EP this, shepherd it, be in it. Arturo Castro, this is where it helps to be kind to agents and to be someone who you attempt to network in Hollywood. And I called a wonderful agent at WME, and I said, I'm in New York making my first feature film. I'm shooting on this date at this time. Who is funny and in New York? And I got a list of 3 names, and I casted all 3 of them. One of them was Arturo Castro. He couldn't be kinder, more talented, and I'm really lucky we got his time.
That's amazing. And then lastly, for both of you, I just wanted to ask, what do you feel that you came away from this project learning the most about your craft?
Oh, that's a great one.
Gosh.
Honestly, I think being adaptable. I've been so lucky. You know, I've had like a pretty cushy filming experience thus far. Obviously, I had like really hard days, but you know, like I was working with like Netflix and, you know, like you have a trailer, all this stuff. So like, this was like my first actual like indie. And, you know, I guess Yes, I guess was also an indie, but this was different because it was like New York in the winter opposed to Atlanta in the fall, which is still just beautiful. You know, like you really learn how to like be adaptable. Like we were having like changes like same day, or like locations that we just need to get out of and move to the next one, or like days where we were like set to shoot on a ferry, couldn't change it, but it also happened to be like one of the coldest days in New York that day. So like figuring out how to say your lines to like your teeth chattering and be like, no, it's actually supposed to be September in the movie, but right now it's fully like almost November and it's freezing and I'm turning blue at the face. So I think it was like this cool experience and like in being adaptable, which I should have learned in school, but I didn't. But yeah, it was cool.
And I would add on to that like everything's going to be okay if like you work hard and you're kind and you're passionate, like it's going to work out, and don't freak out about it not working out, because that's a waste of your mental power. So I would say that was my biggest takeaway, that it was all going to work out.
Yeah. Well, I think with this film, that in the same way that we were talking at the beginning of referencing some of the really timeless rom-coms, that this is absolutely a story that's been told in a way that audiences can still connect with it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and look forward to this becoming part of the vernacular and the way that people talk about rom-coms. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today.
Wow. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for being here.